Um, it was very nice of you guys to come here today, to be in our facility, which I like a great deal. I'm fairly new here, but not new to the area. I worked at the Chippewa Valley Museum for 15 years, then went out to Coos Bay, Oregon, which is also a lumber town, has a Weyerhaeuser plant out there, and has a Georgia Pacific plant out there, and has a Menasha plant out there, so all names that are very familiar to us. And built a museum out there, and then they invited me to come back here, and that was a happy moment because my mom's still out here, and get to hang out with her. And so it's a pleasure to be here this morning. Ed asked me, he said, so are we going to get your notes? And the thing that I didn't tell him until I got up here is I have no idea what I'm going to say till I say it, so I'll have to produce notes after the meeting. But I'm going to talk today a little about I think maybe a surprising part of the story, even some surprises to me. And that's the really long history. We'll try to get through about 1,000 years in about 45 minutes here. So we'll keep moving. And talk a little bit about the Ojibwa, the Dakota, the particular band of Dakota that I'm going to be talking about this morning is the Mdewakanton Dakota, but Dakota is just a lot easier to say. So whenever I say Dakota in the next 45 minutes, know that I'm talking about the Mdewakanton Dakota and not any of the other Dakota bands. And start a little bit with the Ho-Chunk and their forebears, the Oneota people. And their relationship to lumber here is a really complicated and interesting one. And I hope that you'll find some surprises. If anybody's not surprised, good for you. If anybody's angry, just throw something. I'm quick. And we'll just go on from here. Well, I'm going to take you back about 1,000 years ago. Here in this very place, just about half a mile south of here, there's a set of mounds. There's 3 mounds up on top of a hill. And those mounds were built by Oneota people, and Oneota people are the forebears of the Ho-Chunk people. So they lived here for some time, lived here, made art here, grew crops here, raised their families here. And then for reasons we don't understand very well, but had to be resource-based, they left here. And went down to Black River Falls, and the Ho-Chunk people are still at Black River Falls today. You can buy gas at a Ho-Chunk gas station. You can go to the casino. You can go to a number of Ho-Chunk owned businesses there today. They've been in this area for thousands and thousands of years, still here today. That's not true of the Ojibwa. They're fairly recent immigrants to this area, so they're immigrants just like the Norwegians, just like the Swedes. To this particular area, but the Ho-Chunk are Aboriginal people here. So this area that we're sitting in more or less comfortable chairs, you can tell me as the day wears on, was Oneota Ho-Chunk territory. And then after they left probably 1200 AD. For the next few hundred years, this area was not didn't have permanent this particular area didn't have permanent settlements from anybody. The Dakota had their origin story, their center of government now, their ancestral homeland is over in Minnesota on the west side of the Mississippi River. So places like that are named Wabasha and Winona and Shakopee. And Bloomington, a good Indian name, Bloomington. That's their center of life is over there, especially at the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, where Fort Snelling is more or less now, not far from the Mall of America. Fort Snelling, that's not an accident. Fort Snelling was built there. Fort Snelling was built there to assert American influence right there in the heart of Dakota territory. And so they came over here to this section of the country to to hunt. There's lots of game. There was lots of game here. Surprised me when I was a younger person that there were buffalo here. The Buffalo River down at Mondovi is named the Buffalo River, not by accident. It's named the Buffalo River because there were buffalo here. Elk Mound is named Elk Mound because there were elk here, so there were lots of elk. And that's part of the reason that the area didn't have permanent settlements, because the game here was so abundant that there were lots of people competing for it. And you would make, over the year's course, over the season's course, you would make a negotiation with whoever was here at the time, the Meskwaki, who we sometimes call the Fox, the Sauk were coming through here, the Dakota were coming through here, and from about, say, 1700 or so, the Ojibwa started to drift down from Madeline Island. And so, season by season, you would negotiate a little bit. You'd say, if you're a Dakota party, you would negotiate with the Dakota and say, you know, we're going to hunt here this fall, we'll be out of here by the spring. And the Dakota would say, if you're not out here by spring, you're going to run into trouble. So you better be out of here. And that would be negotiated year after year until about 1736, when those negotiations broke down between the Ojibwa and the Dakota and broke into open warfare. And that warfare lasted, in pitched battles, about 120 years. The very last of those battles in this part of Wisconsin was in 1856, like 20 miles north of here, right here in Dunn County, was the very last battle between the Ojibwa and the Dakota. So the territorial controls at that time were constantly negotiated. The one thing that they didn't have much interest in was the trees, because they didn't build with lumber. There were lots of American Indians building with lumber at this time and long before and long after. If you go out on the west coast of Oregon, almost all of their structures are built from wood. They're built from cedar. So certainly American Indians knew how to create log homes. They knew how to create shingle homes. They knew how to, long before contact. But they just didn't do that here. What wood structures they had just used the bark off a birch bark tree and just used willow branches. And so they didn't get into the white pine lumber. There were other people in other parts of the country cutting down trees just as big as the white pines, cutting down giant red cedar, cutting down Douglas fir, but these guys weren't cutting down trees because they didn't build with trees. And what they did, once the French came in here, was trade for beaver. And you all know that story just a little bit, do you? The fur trade. We're going to talk about that just for a minute. I will get to lumber. I swear to God I'll get to lumber here at some point. But the story is heavily influenced by the fur trade. So they're here negotiating back and forth, living their lives, doing things. And then the French show up. The French, as you guys know, they're good cooks and nice people. And so the Ojibwa in particular, the Dakota also, formed and slightly awkward because they're Europeans versus Native Americans, but generally warm relationship with the French. French men married Ojibwa women, married Dakota women. We tend to think of that, or we were taught that in school, that this was sort of a marriage of convenience. If you're a lonely guy out in the woods, why you're looking for a wife to have. That's not exactly true. These were strategic alliances. So you might marry the leading warrior of the Bear Clan. You might marry the head of government from the Crane Clan. And these would make strategic alliances, especially if you were a French fur trader. And one of the very famous French fur traders in this area was Michel Cadot, who Cadot, Wisconsin, is named after. But he's much more, I mean, not that Cadot, Wisconsin's not influential, I don't want to say that, but he's much more influential than Cadot. He's like Milwaukee, influential, or Chicago influential. And they have been up on Madeline Island. The Ojibwa have been up on Madeline Island for a long time, from 1600 or perhaps even before. And the Cadott family has been up there for generations. LeGrand Michel Cadott, his dad, Jean-Baptiste Cadott, and then his dad, Michel Cadott, and then his dad, Jean-Baptiste Cadott, goes up Michel, Jean-Baptiste for generations. It makes the genealogy a little bit confusing. But they've been up there for a very, very long time, probably since the 1760s. The Ojibwa there for some time before, and perhaps eons and eons before, but having lost their way, drifted out towards Montreal and finding their way back home to Madeline Island. And so they've been by the time we're going to talk about the treaties, by the Treaty of 1825 and by the Treaty of 1837, the Ojibwa have been trading with people in this area for 100 years, for more than 100 years. Down south and west on the Mississippi River, the Dakota people have been trading mainly in Prairie du Chien. And so they've been trading with another French guy named James Rolette, Joseph Rolette, and a Yankee guy named James Lockwood. And they've been trading furs with those guys. Those guys are going to be really important to our story. And then a little bit later, we'll meet Hercules Dousman. And anybody here been to Villa Louis down in Prairie du Chien? That's his house, really quite a grand house, Hercules Dousman. So down river, the Dakota are trading with Rolette and Lockwood. Upriver, way at the top of the Chippewa Valley, the Ojibwa have been trading with Cadott family. By about 1800, the beaver are starting to run out here. The beaver are going to run out all the way across the country. Before contact with white people, there were about 40 million beaver in North America. There are about 4 million now. So 9/10 of the beaver in this country are gone. Even now, even after natural increase over the last 100 years, we have about 1/10 of the beaver that we had in 1600. And they're playing out as we go across America. All the beaver are gone in Massachusetts, all the beaver are gone in Maine, all the beaver are gone on the St. Lawrence Seaway, around the eastern Great Lakes, and we're coming and hunting beaver not to extinction, but to scarcity. And so they've gotten to Wisconsin, and by 1800, there are a lot less beaver than they were. That's about when muskrat, who are not very valuable compared with beaver, that's when muskrat take over beaver as the most trapped animal up here. Now, do you know why beaver are so valuable? Men's fashion. The whole early economy of North America is built on men's fashion. So the beavers, if you treat them with caustic and mind-altering chemicals, anybody ever heard the expression "mad as a hatter"? That's where that expression comes from. Then you can make that into a nice felted hat. You can send the beaver pelts over to England and then treat them with these caustic chemicals. And then Lewis Carroll writes a book about it, all in rhyme and stuff. And then those get turned into hats, and those get sold in Munich and in St. Petersburg and in Moscow and in London and in Paris. And men wear them, and they're nice, warm, very sturdy hats. That will be true for hundreds and hundreds of years, that this style, like, women's fashions change quite a bit, right? Men's fashion don't change at all. So for hundreds of years, this is a fashion. And the poor beaver suffers for it. And by 1800 here, the beavers are getting to be scarce. And so the Dakota and the Ojibwa and the fur traders, Rolette and Lockwood, are looking for a new commodity that they can sell. Well, because beavers, they're not going to make it. Their prices go up and down. Sometimes you have a good season, sometimes you have a bad season. Ojibwa, because of that, are getting into debt from the traders because they need things every year and they don't have beaver every year. So everybody, and of course the traders, they want money, and if there's no money to be had and there's no commodity to be had, they're going to suffer as well. So they're looking for a new commodity. As it turns out, 1/6 of all the white pine east of the Rockies is right here in the Chippewa Valley. And that wood has really some incredible characteristics. One, because the trees are so big, they're 500 years old, the very biggest of the trees, and you all know this, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, could yield 8,000 board feet of lumber from a single tree. Now that was a very rare tree. Most of them, even a midland tree, would give off 2,000 or 3,000 board feet of lumber at that time. So just gigantic trees. But because the canopy, now this whole area was not covered with pine trees. That's one of the things that people think when they come into our museum, and it's not actually true, but there was a pinery where there's a lot more white pine than there are other kinds of trees. And that area was not very full of game because, as you guys know, white pine trees are very jealous trees. So there's not a lot that grows under them. There's not a lot for deer and elk and buffalo to eat, so there's not a lot of good hunting. So that land is pretty sterile, whereas the land around the rivers, the red cedar, the Chippewa, the yellow, the flambeau, those rivers are full of game, and so they're roads of war. So the land is not too valuable to the Ojibwa people up north. The trees are not very valuable because they don't use them for anything. But they understand that white people are moving in to the Midwest. So they're moving into St. Louis. St. Louis is bigger at the time than Chicago. They're moving into places all along the Mississippi River. They're moving into Illinois. And there's a shortage of lumber down there because they don't grow trees as well in Illinois and Iowa and further south than they grow up here. So you want lumber, and white pine is great. Not only do you get a lot out of a tree, but because the canopy is so thick in parts of it, there's not a lot of branches low in the tree, so there's not a lot of knots, and so there's a lot of clear lumber in that. Really good for building, really good for making shingles, really good for making watertight shingles, and probably the best characteristic that it has compared to the oak tree is that it floats. You put it in water and it floats. And so when you cut it down and drag it out of the woods in the winter and put it by the bank of the river, then the next spring, the flood, you just throw them in the river and they float down to Menomonie, they float down to Eau Claire. You can saw them up, you can put them onto rafts, bind them together, and you can send them down to St. Louis and you can make money that way. But the very first of those didn't go that way to Menomonie necessarily. They didn't go that way to Eau Claire necessarily. Any questions so far? Does that sort of makes sense? I think one of the things that surprises me a little bit, because it's not in any of the history books that we saw in school, one of the ideas that we have about Ojibwa people and one of the ideas that we have about Dakota people is that they're primitive people. That will influence American thought for generations, maybe even almost to this day. But they're not primitive people. They just don't have technology that Europeans have. But even the traders don't have technology. I mean, traders are not sitting in their garrets in Prairie du Chien making guns. They're getting their guns from England too. They're not weaving fabrics. They're getting their fabrics from England too. All of the stuff for white people and all of the stuff for Indian people around here is being imported from somewhere. And that's the basis of the fur trade, that you give up these furs, you give up these beavers, and in return you get anything that you could possibly need or imagine except for the iPhone 8. But you could get mirrors, you could get spoons, you could get knives, you could get kettles, you could get guns. But those weren't the majority of goods that were traded. The majority of goods, those are the majority of goods that were found because those last pretty long because they're made out of metal. The majority of goods that were traded were woven fabrics. So the pure majority of things that were traded were woven fabrics. And that's how, and man, it took a long time. So you would, if you're a fur trader here and you wanted china for your table, you would send a note from a fur trade post up here, and it would go to Fort William, and then it would go from Fort William to Fort Detroit, and it would go from Fort Detroit to Montreal, and then that note would get put on a boat, and then would get sent to England, and then you'd get your china, and it was packed in this barrel, and the barrel was filled with sawdust, and then the sawdust was wetted so the sawdust would expand. Made a nice tight bundle of china. And then the barrel would be put on a boat from England to Montreal, and then it'd be put on a boat to Fort Detroit, and then it'd be put on a boat to Fort William, and then it would be put on a bateau and brought to Madeline Island, and then it would be put on a canoe and brought down, and sometime about 2 years later you'd get your china. And so you'd be really happy when you got your china at that point, because you'd been waiting, unless it was broken. And then you'd be really unhappy having waited 2 years for your china. So the stable commodity that was going to replace the beaver was the clear, floatable, soft but strong white pine lumber. The territorial controls by the 1820s, let me back up just for a minute. One of the things that happens that doesn't have too much influence at all on the Ojibwa people or the Dakota people is that the government just keeps changing out here, right? So until 1763, the French have control over this area. And by control, that means they have a few hundred guys out here making money, shipping goods back and forth, and marrying and having families, and hiring really strong guys to row their canoes, and the Ojibwa people are trading with them. In 1763, they lose the French and Indian War. Well, they lose the negotiation after the French and Indian War to the English, and so the English take over. And so Michel Cadot up in Madeline Island, he's a French guy. After the English take over, Michel Cadot goes to work for the English. So as far as the Ojibwa are concerned, there's no change at all. You're working with Michel Cadot, you're working with Rolette. Actually, Lockwood's kind of a new guy, he's a Yankee. And so after 1783, at the Treaty of Ghent, which officially ends the Revolutionary War, the English cede the territory to the Americans. So the Americans have control over the country. So Michel Cadot, who you've been trading with up on Madeline Island, he was working for the English. Michel Cadot is working for the Americans after 1783. So if you're an Ojibwa person, you're still dealing with Michel Cadot. Nothing has changed for you. It is not until the War of 1812 that things start to change. So the War of 1812 is much more influential up here even than the Revolutionary War. I think the War of 1812 is a really underrepresented war in this country. I think it was one of our really foundational wars. One of the things that happens after the War of 1812 that has an effect on us is that, at least for a brief time, all ownership, all leadership of fur trade companies in North America have to be, that leadership has to be American citizens. So you've got companies like the Northwest Company, which is basically a French-based company, the Hudson Bay Company, which is probably England, not just an English company, but probably England. At least over here, it's got more influence than the Crown does. Those guys actually have to skedaddle. They've never had to skedaddle. Nobody's had to skedaddle, but they actually have to. And so they get out of here, and of course there's not as much influence. The American government is so weak and just can't get very far in America. So the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, they just move out to Oregon and Washington, and they still are in business for some years after that. They move up to Canada, where, I mean, Hudson Bay Company is still a company up there. But they skedaddle out of here. And American interests come in. The American Fur Company comes in. That's owned by John Jacob Astor. You may have heard of John Jacob Astor. He's the richest man. He becomes the richest man in America. He's the richest man ever, inflation adjusted. He's richer than Rockefeller. He's richer than anybody else because of this, because he now has taken all of the profits from the Northwest Company, all the profits from the Hudson Bay Company, and consolidated them. And so even though by 1812 we're sort of running out of beaver, he's the guy, and so everybody goes to work for him. Michel Cadotte goes to work for him, Rolette goes to work for him, Lockwood goes to work for him, Hercules Dousman comes on the scene as a partner, and he goes to work for him. Now let me get to the territorial controls. So the territorial controls here, like I said, are negotiated year after year. A little further south, it's like America, like the United States government. The Ojibwa people are powerful people, but their influence only extends so far. They can't keep control of the lower Red Cedar, the lower Chippewa, the Mississippi. They'd like to. They'd like to have the control over that, but their influence doesn't reach that far. The Dakota would love to have influence all the way up north in Wisconsin, but their influence doesn't go that far. So they cross right here in Dunn County. And that's where all the fighting takes place, is here in Dunn County. And that's where all the negotiating. So downriver from here, it's Dakota territory upriver, it's Ojibwa territory. And that is going to start to cause some trouble, because the scheme may be too harsh a word, the plan that the Dakota people developed with Rolette and with Lockwood is the area where there are trees that we have territorial control of. You can cut the trees. It's our land, but we give you extraction rights. So it's like mineral rights, except it's trees. We give you extraction rights on those trees. So you can cut them down, but when you start to float them, you also have to pay us a toll on the river, or we won't let them pass. So here's, you pay us in two ways. You pay us extraction rights on a long-term lease. We'll lease it for 5-7 years. And you can cut all the trees you want. And you put them in the river, and you pay us a toll, and then you can float them down to St. Louis, and you can build America that way. That works for a little while, except the Ojibwa start to notice that, once all the trees that those guys have influence on are gone, they're going to start coming up here. And they're going to start cutting trees that we would like to get money for. And nobody has talked to us about getting money for these trees. So why is that? And we don't like that. And we don't think you should proceed until you understand that we're serious about getting money out of this operation too, because our beaver are getting scarce, and we would like tolls, and we would like leases. And so let's just prove that we're serious. In some way, let's try to think of a way to prove that we're serious. So these guys, Rolette, Lockwood, a guy named Perkins, they come up here, they build a couple of mills. They're going to mill the lumber down here, and then they're going to make rafts, and they're going to float it down. That worked for a little while, and they're cutting, they've got their lease in place with Dakota people. They've got their trees, they've got their milling machines, they know how to tie them into logs. There's no treaty with the U.S. government. And the Ojibwa then come and burn down their mill. And that should prove to them that they're serious about negotiating with the Ojibwa, starting to talk to the Ojibwa. And then another one of their mills gets flooded out in one of the spring freshets. And so our guys, who you know and love by now, Rolette, Lockwood, Perkins, they're like, this is kind of getting tight here. This is kind of getting scary. I don't know about this. By the 1820s, they're thinking, the farther we get into Ojibwa territory, this is getting kind of scary. We don't want to end up dead. We want to end up rich, And I mean, that seems like a good goal, So we've got to back off, and we've got to think about this. So they don't rebuild their mill right away. They just go back to Prairie du Chien, and they regroup a little bit. And then they think, all right, well, if the Ojibwa are serious about this, we're serious about this too. And so let's go and talk to them, and let's sign the same sort of lease up there. So they do sign the same sort of lease. Now, this gets into a difference between the Ojibwa and the Dakota people. One of the things that we're taught in school is that they're American Indians, or now we're supposed to call them Native Americans, but the Ojibwa The Ojibwa consider themselves American Indians, which is why I say American Indians when I'm not just saying Ojibwa or Dakota. But there are 562 recognized different nations on the North American continent. They all have different histories, they all have different stories, they all have different dialects, they all have different languages. And so it's hard to talk about American Indians generally, and this is one of those cases. The Dakota, they're very happy with the arrangement that they've made with Rolette and Lockwood, and everybody's making money and they can buy goods and they're not getting into as much debt as they used to get to because they'd have to buy all their tools at the beginning of the season, then they might not get enough beavers, so they'd be extended credit. They're happy with this arrangement. The Ojibwa have built up their arrangement over many, many, many years in a very different way. They have grown to be families with the traders, particularly the Cadotte family and all of the many branches of the Cadotte family, the Ermatinger family, and all sorts of people up in this area. They've married into them. They've knitted this society together. And so what they want to do, they don't want to just quit the fur trade and move on to the lumber trade. What they want to do is solidify, smooth out, amplify, add to the fur trade that they're doing and these people who they know, these family members that they know. So they want to add this into. So they're suspicious of these new guys. They're suspicious of Rolette. They're suspicious of Lockwood. They've been trading up north with people they know and love. So they want assurances that this is going to be an extension of the ceremonial and friendship-based trade that they've known for many generations. It's not just about the money. They want the money, but it's not just about the money. They want to know that these guys are committed to a way of life that the Ojibwa want to sustain. So they make a lease that's very similar in the end to the Dakota's lease. You can cut down our trees. You can take them to the river. You pay us a lease. Here's a long-term lease. They signed that lease in about 1830. And we'll see how it goes. The American government is uncomfortable with all of this. They know that guys like Cadotte, guys like Rolette, guys like Lockwood work for the English. Rolette worked for the French. Cadotte worked for the French. So where do their allegiances lie? They fought with the British up until 1812. So what now? You're going to turn around and fight for the Americans? They're making money off the Indians. So what now? They're going to pledge allegiance to the Americans? I don't think so. So the United States government is suspicious of this activity. Besides, it seems rogue. I mean, because they're making these leases not with the American government that owns the land, as far as the American government is concerned, because they got it in a treaty. They are making leases that don't have anything to do with the American government. The American government's not profiting from it. They're not getting any title to the land. They're not getting anything from this. This seems like black market stuff to them. But there's one more component that is true of the Americans. It was a little bit true of the British, not true very much at all of the French. That's that the Americans have a very long history, a 2-century long history at this time of seeing Indians as inferior people. This comes from their Puritan upbringing where anybody who's not like you is an inferior person. And they see them as violent people, and that they had sort of a bad first encounter in 1621 in Virginia, and a whole bunch of them got massacred, and that sort of tainted things for, oh, I don't know, the next 350 years. And then they met resistance at every path that they took across America. They met people who didn't want to give up their land, and there were people who were not like them. And there were people who didn't worship like them, most importantly, but also didn't live like them and didn't have the same technology of them and didn't have the same skin color as them. So these were inferior people. So that was a complicating element. The other complicating element is that unlike the traders who weren't interested in the land at all, I mean, Hercules Dousman already had a nice house. He didn't need another nice house. He already had a nice house. But the government, the United States government, was elected by the people of the United States, and one of the goals of the people of the United States was to have land to live on. And so that's a very different goal from the traders, that you want to get the land. And so all of this is sort of coming to a head in the 1820s. You've got the Ojibwa people who are attacking the mills. You've got Dakota people who are signing these rogue contracts. And so the United States government says, you know, we ought to get everybody together and get everybody on the same page. It's 1825. There's no more time for this nonsense. We've got people pouring into the Midwest. And so let's set up a big conference, a big confab in Prairie du Chien, because everybody knows Prairie du Chien. So let's invite as many people as we can. 1,000 people come, including 350 Dakota people and as many Ojibwa people as can make it down. They have this many-day conference. And the United States explains the conference, what it's all about. You guys have been at war for a long time. You've been at war to the Ojibwa and Dakota. You've been at war for 90 or 100 years. We want to stop this. You cannot keep having wars forever, although I think they probably actually could have. But you can't do that, because that's not the way we work here. We want to have peace. And the only way that we can have peace, the reason you guys are at war is because you don't know what land you have title to, right? So you guys are fighting over Dunn County. There's no Dunn County at that point, but you know what I mean. So you guys are fighting over this territory where all the game is. Now, if we assign part of it to you, the Dakota, and you stay there, and we assign part of it to you guys, the Ojibwa, and you stay there, we're not going to have any more wars, because what they knew about history was that war, and this is true, was that war is all about land. So that's why Germany has been at war fairly much constantly for 1,100 years, except for the last 20, 25 years. They've been doing pretty well for the most part. And so that's the history they come with. So we're going to get here, and we're going to determine that the Ojibwa own this, the Dakota own that. The Ho-Chunk don't own very much, even though it was all their land originally. The Sauk people, they can own some stuff down south, and we'll get this all straightened out. Then we'll have peace. What they didn't tell the Ojibwa or the Dakota or anybody else is that one of their goals was to get the land, because that's what they were elected to do. But one of the things about American legal theory is that you can't buy something unless you know who owns it. I might like your car, but unless I know that you own it, I can't buy it from you. I don't know who to buy it from. And so once you establish ownership in 1825, then at some later point, you know who you're going to buy the land from. Does that make sense? So if we cut up the land, you know, if you own this and you own this, then at some later point we want to buy it, we can buy it from you, and we can buy that other parcel from you. But the ostensible reason for the 1825 treaty is just to create peace, and the peace is just to cut up the land so that you know where you're hunting, and you know where you're gathering, and you know where you're, well, all right, taking lumber from at the moment, and that'll be better. That'll be a first step. And that doesn't necessarily change the relationship between Rolette, between Lockwood, and the Cadott. He's not really involved in the lumber trade. And Dousman, they're still selling trees. They're still putting together lumber bundles. But then the United States starts to put its plan into action, because they have people. I mean, who wants to come to Wisconsin? It's got a lot of mosquitoes, right? But once you move west far enough, once you start to fill up Illinois, and you've filled up Indiana, you filled up the East Coast pretty well, then you're going to get to Wisconsin. And so by 1837, people are wanting to get into Wisconsin. They're already in southern Wisconsin. They're mining lead. They're filling up Milwaukee. Green Bay is a big city. They're moving. They want to move west into Wisconsin. So they want that. They want that land. They want that land where we're standing right now. So the American government, smart enough, and knowing that the two tribes are different, they signed two separate treaties, both in 1837, one with Dakota and one with the Ojibwa. And they do them in very, very different ways. So the U.S. government is incredibly worried that the fur traders in Prairie du Chien will have undue influence on the Dakota and say, you know, that's a bad deal. You shouldn't sell your land. That's really a bad deal. You should just keep doing what we're doing. You should lease the land. We'll make some money. We'll have some drinks. It'll be fun. And so the U.S. government invites Dakota representatives to come to Washington, D.C., far away from the influence of Prairie du Chien. And that has another byproduct. The first byproduct is to get them away from the traders. The second one is that the East Coast of the United States is so developed at that point, Washington, D.C., New York City, that once the Dakota come out there, they're going to see that there is no way to fight them. That this is a giant country with giant resources, a giant population. You cannot fight these people. They will crush you. And so we bring them out here. We teach them that we can crush them in the nicest possible way. We just show them all our big buildings. We get them away from the traders, and they sell our land, and that's what happens. The Ojibwa, they take a different tack because they understand that this continuation of the fur trade, this continuation of familial relationships is important. This idea of homeland is more important than this idea of money that we talked about before. So they have their conference up at Fort Snelling in Minnesota and invite all the people from Wisconsin, some of the people from Minnesota, everybody to come to Fort Snelling, which is pretty near their home. A lot of them can get there. They can talk for a week. They can work it all out. And instead of offering them this sort of cut and dried offer, we're going to buy your land. And the Dakota are like, not our land. You can have it. Because the land up north is under Ojibwa control. So if you want to give us cash for that, that's fine. I mean, I can sell you Don's car really easily. It doesn't cost me a thing to sell you Don's car. I still have a car to drive when I'm done with it, right? And so for the Dakota, they're happy to sell land that's not theirs, that they're not living in, that they're just hunting in occasionally. They've already gone across the river, many generations ago. The Ojibwa, that's a little different problem. So they talk it out for a week. And the Ojibwa say very clearly, in the discussions of the treaty, here's what we sell you. We sell you the trees. We do not sell you the root of the trees. We do not sell you the fish in the waters. We do not sell you the wild rice. We sell you the trees. And if you want to give us a lot of money for the trees, if you want to give us $800,000 for the trees, that's just fine. But we reserve these. We reserve the root of the tree. That's the way the discussion goes, but that's not the way the treaty goes. The treaty goes that the land has been ceded from the Ojibwa to the United States government to sell to settlers or, more often land speculators. So the Ojibwa go home thinking that they're going to continue these relationships that they built with the traders, continue their leases, continue the way of life, but only amplified by a big, new, wealthy trading partner, much more wealthy than Rolette, much more wealthy than Lockwood. The United States doesn't have much money at that point, but they have more money than any individual has. So we've got a brand new trading partner. We know that this is going to be a good agreement because we have made many agreements over 100 years with various kinds of people. We've made agreements every season with the Dakota for years. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. There are these pitch battles, that's okay. We made agreements with Kadat, which they've honored through many generations. We've made agreements just a few years ago with Dousman, Rolette, and Lockwood. Those seem to be going fine. So we know how to make an agreement. We're not just barefoot pilgrims. We know how to make an agreement here. So we have agreed to sell you the trees, and that's great. They, because nobody's moving up into this land quite yet, the treaty takes effect, it's ratified by Congress, nothing much changes, and it seems like the dream of the Ojibwa has come true. They've gotten some yearly payments, nothing much has changed, life is the way that it was, and they've gotten this infusion of cash which they can then buy. They've paid off their previous debts to the traders. They're at square one again. It's given them this boost of cash, and they can go back about their business. What they don't know is shortly people will start arriving in the larger Chippewa Valley. So people are already starting a little bit to move into Menomonie. By the 1840s, they're starting to move into Chippewa Falls in fairly good numbers. The 1850s, the little kid brother of Menomonie and Chippewa Falls, Eau Claire, Wisconsin, this little town at the confluence of the Eau Claire and Chippewa rivers. People are starting to move into there. And in 1850, the population of Eau Claire is 100. In 1855, it's 1,000. In 1870, it's 10,000. So there starts to be this land rush. The Ojibwa remind the government, and they will continue to remind the government for an entire generation, that that's not the treaty that they made. It's not that they gave up and just went onto the reservations. They go to try to renegotiate the treaty again and again and again, and saying this is not what you agreed to, clear up until 1864. That's the last of the treaty negotiations that's trying to make the United States government understand that that's not what they agreed to in 1837. By that point, the Ojibwa people are already moved onto reservations in 1850, in the early 1850s, and there's a whole story that goes along with that. And lumbering interests, the United States has its dream because the traders who they don't trust have been pushed out of this process, and other lumbering interests have come in. So other guys, because now the United States believes they have title to this land, they can start inviting investors who are not these scoundrels, who are not these French scoundrels, who are not these British scoundrels, who are good American Yankee citizens who are going to prosecute the lumber trade in the way that it should be prosecuted, the legitimate way that it should be prosecuted. So they start inviting people like Carson and Stout, and these guys are getting land, they're scouting timber, and there's of course these individuals. Dousman, as rich as he was, and as influential as he was, Rolette, as long as he'd been there, Lockwood, as enterprising and passionate and as enthusiastic as he was. These guys were three guys, right? They didn't make a big dent in the pinery, even though it was working pretty well. But you have big organizations that are going to be built here. So Carson's going to be a fairly big operation. Shaw is going to be a fairly big operation. Don and I were having a talk last night. Knapp Stout is arguably, is that the right word, Ed? Arguably the largest lumber operation in the world at one time. And so these guys are coming in and they're serious. And so the inexhaustible pinery, the pinery that everybody thought was inexhaustible, is gone in a couple of generations. And then we start farming and we build factories and we build universities and we build teaching schools. And we come up to the present day. But the thing I think that's probably important to recognize or remember is that the Ojibwa and the Dakota were not taken advantage of by the traders. Individual traders, individual families, individual Ojibwa families, individual Dakota families, sure. But not by the traders in general. Everybody made the best deal they can, and they were both hard negotiators. They were both hard negotiators. When they were proactive, so when they saw the beavers start to run out, they said, we need a new commodity. We've got trees that we're not using. Apparently people have cash that they're not using, or apparently they want to build homes that they're homeless unless they get these logs. So let's all make a deal. And so they come into these treaty negotiations. The treaty negotiations of 1820, around here, there's lots of treaties. There are probably 10 treaties that cover Wisconsin. I only know anything at all, just enough to get myself into trouble about 2 of those treaties. So the 1825 treaty and the 1837 treaty. There's 1854 treaty, there's 1842 treaty, there's 1818 treaty. A lot of treaties in Wisconsin. They all have different stories. Those are the stories of these 2 treaties. One guy who's involved in 6 treaties with the U.S. government is a fellow named Kichiwashke, or Great Buffalo. He lives on Madeline Island. And he, I think, is a hero who is massively underrepresented in U.S. history and certainly in Wisconsin history. At all points, he's a sophisticated guy. He's been around for a long time. He was born back in, he's born back in the 1750s. He's born before the French and Indian War. And at each point in the process, he makes the very best deal for his people that he can. So when they're at the 1837 treaty, he makes an understanding. Now, he comes to quickly realize after the treaty that the treaty is not the treaty that he thought he was signing. But instead of going to war, like the Dakota will do in the 1860s, right? They will do in Minnesota. They'll start open warfare and open resistance, which ends up a disaster in Minnesota. I mean, this is true. This is a fact, that it's illegal for a Dakota person to live in Minnesota to this very day. Now, of course, there are lots of Dakota people living in Minnesota, going to UW or University of Minnesota and working at factory jobs and living their lives, but it's still illegal for a Dakota person. Kichiwashke, Great Buffalo, takes a very different tack, and he makes the best negotiation he can. So in 1854, he negotiates reservations. And so unlike the Sauk, unlike the Meskwaki, unlike the Potawatomi, unlike the Cherokee, unlike the Choctaw, unlike any of 100 nations you can think of, the Ojibwa are not removed from their homeland. They're still in their homeland today. They're in a tiny part of their homeland. So Lecoutere, Lac du Flambeau, Bad River, Red Cliff, those are tiny parts of northern Wisconsin, but they're still in northern Wisconsin. So he makes the best deal at every juncture that he can, and he does that in 1852. As a 93-year-old man, he takes off in a canoe and goes across Lake Superior and then goes across Lake Erie and catches a train, goes to Washington. He doesn't have any entry to the White House, runs into a senator. The senator says, I'll take you to the White House, brings along a pipe, smokes the pipe with Franklin Pierce, and they agree that they don't have to be removed from their homeland, and that's how the whole treaty comes apart. This 93-year-old guy. That's a true story. And so he's a hero to the Ojibwa people, but he's a guy who's constantly renegotiating the Ojibwa's role in the world. Now, I think I'm probably running fairly short on time, and I did get through 1,000 years of history in about 45 minutes.